Picture something as long as a soccer field, as tall as a five-story building, weighing more than 100 elephants, and yet lifting silently into the clouds as if it weighed nothing at all. That was the Airbus A380, the largest passenger plane ever to fly, a double-decked giant with onboard bars, private suites, and even showers cruising 7 miles above the earth. It felt less like an airplane and more like a floating hotel, a dream of what flying could become. And yet, for all its wonder, this magnificent machine would vanish from the assembly line far sooner than anyone imagined, quietly slipping toward history while millions still adored it. So tonight, as you settle in and let your breathing slow, we'll drift gently through the story of the plane that was somehow too big to survive. Picture something the size of a small building weighing more than 500 tons, lifting itself gently off a runway and climbing into the sky as if gravity had simply agreed to let it go. That is the Airbus A380, and if you have ever stood beneath one, you know the strange feeling it creates. Your mind tells you that something this enormous should not be able to fly, yet it does, smoothly, quietly, almost effortlessly, and there is a kind of peace in watching it rise. Tonight you can let that peace settle over you, because this is the story of the largest passenger aircraft ever to carry human beings through the air, told slowly, gently, the way a story should be told when you are ready to rest. The A380 was never meant to be ordinary. From its very first sketches, it was imagined as a statement, a bold answer to a question that had haunted the aviation world for decades. How do you move more people, more comfortably, across the vast oceans and continents of a shrinking planet? The engineers at Airbus believed the answer was simple in concept, even if it was staggering in execution. You build bigger. You build something so large that a single aircraft could carry the population of an entire village from one side of the world to the other. And so, quietly at first, in offices and design halls across Europe, the dream of a double-decked giant began to take shape. You might think that building a bigger plane is just a matter of scaling everything up, stretching the wings, lengthening the body, adding a few more rows of seats. But the real secret is far more delicate than that. Every time you make an aircraft larger, you fight harder against the invisible forces that want to keep it on the ground. Weight grows faster than strength. Air resistance climbs. The engines must work harder, the wings must flex further, and the entire structure must be reimagined from the inside out. The people who designed the A380 understood this, and rather than being frightened by it, they leaned into the challenge with a patience that borders on the poetic. They spent years refining shapes you will never see, testing materials you will never touch, all so that one day you could sit inside this machine and feel nothing but calm. When the first whispers of the project reached the wider world, the excitement was electric. Airlines began to imagine what they could offer their passengers. Newspapers speculated about the size of the thing, drawing comparisons to ships and buildings and creatures of myth. There was a sense, even before the aircraft existed in its final form, that something historic was approaching, and history, when it comes to flight, has always moved in great leaps. From the fragile wooden frames of the earliest pioneers to the sleek jets that shrank the globe, aviation has been a story of humans reaching further than they had any right to reach. The A380 felt like the next great chapter in that story, and the anticipation grew with every passing year. To understand just how ambitious this machine was, it helps to imagine its scale in the gentlest possible terms. The wingspan of the A380 stretches nearly 80 meters from tip to tip, wide enough that if you laid it across a football pitch, the wings would spill over both edges. The tail rises as high as a 7-story building, standing quietly on the tarmac like a monument to human daring. And inside, across 2 full decks running the entire length of the fuselage, there is space enough to seat well over 500 passengers in a typical arrangement, and in some configurations many more than that. It is not merely large, it is a cathedral of the sky, a place designed to hold hundreds of lives in comfort while it drifts above the clouds. Yet size alone was never the point. What truly captured imaginations was the promise of what could be done with all that space. Airlines began to dream of things that had never existed on an aircraft before. There were plans for private suites with doors that closed for privacy, for lounges where passengers could stand and stretch and speak with one another, for showers, real flowing showers, thousands of feet above the earth. The A380 was not simply going to move people from one place to another. It was going to redefine what it meant to travel in luxury, transforming the long, weary hours of an intercontinental flight into something that felt almost restful. And perhaps that is fitting, because there is something inherently soothing about the idea of a machine so vast that it can carry you gently, quietly through the night. Now consider the moment it first took to the skies. When the A380 lifted off for its earliest flights, crowds gathered simply to watch it move. There is a particular quality to the way a very large aircraft flies, a slowness that is almost hypnotic. Because it is so big, your eyes struggle to judge its speed, and it seems to hang in the air, floating rather than rushing, as though it has all the time in the world. People who witnessed those first appearances often describe the same sensation. They expected noise, chaos, the roar of raw power. Instead, they found a strange serenity, a giant gliding overhead with an unexpected grace. And that contrast between the immense weight and the gentle motion is part of what makes this aircraft so endlessly fascinating. Here is where the wonder deepens. You might assume that something so enormous would be crude, a blunt instrument of engineering muscle. But in truth, the A380 is a marvel of precision. Every curve of its body was shaped to slip through the air with as little resistance as possible. Its wings were engineered to bend and flex in flight, absorbing the invisible turbulence of the atmosphere the way a tree bends in the wind, rather than snapping against it. The materials chosen for its construction included advanced composites, lighter and stronger than the metals of older aircraft, carefully placed where they would do the most good. In other words, this giant was not just big, it was clever, it was refined. It was the product of countless small decisions, each one made to ensure that when you finally boarded it, you would feel safe and calm. And calm is really the word that suits this machine best. Inside the cabin, the A380 was designed to be quieter than almost anything that had flown before it. The vast interior, the careful placement of the engines, and the thoughtful engineering of the fuselage all worked together to hush the sound of flight. Passengers often remarked that they could hardly believe they were airborne at all. Conversations flowed easily. Sleep came gently. The subtle rumble that so many travelers associate with flying was softened into something closer to a distant, comforting hum. It was, in many ways, the perfect aircraft to fall asleep aboard. And perhaps that is a lovely thought to hold as you settle in tonight. But the story of the A380 is not only a story of triumph. There is a shadow woven through its history, a tension that gives its journey a bittersweet depth. This aircraft was born from a particular vision of the future, a belief about how the world would travel, and that vision would eventually be challenged in ways its creators never fully anticipated. The very qualities that made it magnificent, its size, its ambition, its grandeur, would also make it vulnerable. There is a reason this machine is sometimes called the plane too big to survive, and over the coming hours we will drift slowly through that story, exploring how something so beloved and so remarkable could find itself struggling in a world that was quietly changing beneath its wings. For now, though, there is no need to rush toward that part of the tale. Let it wait. Let yourself simply sit with the image of this gentle giant at the dawn of its life, when everything seemed possible and the sky felt wide enough to hold any dream. Picture it once more, rising slowly into the blue, its enormous wings catching the light, hundreds of travelers cradled quietly within. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders soften. There is a long, peaceful journey ahead of us, and you are welcome to close your eyes and let the story carry you the way this remarkable machine has carried so many others, gently, patiently into the calm of the open sky. The wings of the Airbus A380 stretch nearly 79 meters from tip to tip, a span so wide that it very nearly matches the length of the aircraft itself. To put that into a shape your mind can hold, imagine standing at one wingtip and trying to see a friend waving at the other. They would appear small and distant, separated from you by roughly the length of a football field. These are not merely large wings, they are among the largest ever fitted to a commercial airliner, and everything about them was designed to lift an aircraft that could weigh more than 500 tons when fully loaded with passengers, fuel, and cargo. That is a staggering amount of mass to coax gently into the sky, and yet these wings do it with a grace that almost defies belief. Here is where the wonder begins to deepen. You might think that lifting something so heavy would require raw, brutal force, that the wings would have to fight the air with everything they had. But the real secret is far more elegant than that. The wings of the A380 were shaped with an extraordinary curve, a profile refined through years of testing and calculation, so that the air flowing over the top moves faster than the air passing beneath. That difference in speed creates a difference in pressure, and it is this quiet imbalance, invisible and silent, that draws the entire aircraft upward. The wing does not push against the sky so much as it persuades the sky to hold it, and that persuasion, multiplied across hundreds of square meters of surface, is enough to carry a small city of travelers into the clouds. There is another remarkable detail hidden in the way these wings behave once they are aloft. If you were sitting by a window and happened to glance out toward the wingtip during a bit of turbulence, you might notice something that could seem alarming at first. The wing moves. It flexes upward, sometimes bending several meters at its extreme end, rising and settling like a great bird easing its way through unsettled air. But this is not a flaw. This is precisely what the engineers wanted. A rigid wing would transmit every jolt and shudder straight into the cabin, and it would risk cracking under the constant strain of flight. A flexible wing, on the other hand, absorbs those forces, spreading them out and softening them, so that the ride inside remains smooth and the structure remains sound for decades. That gentle bending you might glimpse is a sign of health, not danger. It is the wing breathing with the sky. To achieve that combination of enormous strength and forgiving flexibility, the designers reached for materials that had rarely been used on such a scale. Large portions of the wing and the surrounding structure were built from advanced composites, layered fibers set into resin and cured into shapes that were both lighter and more resilient than traditional aluminum. Every gram mattered on an aircraft this size, because weight is the eternal enemy of flight. The heavier the plane, the more fuel it burns, and the more fuel it burns, the more it costs to fly. So engineers hunted for weight savings in every panel, every spar, every joint, placing the strongest materials only where the loads demanded them and using lighter ones elsewhere. The result was a wing that was astonishingly strong for its weight, a careful balance of muscle and restraint written into every layer of its construction. But the size of these wings also created problems that were almost philosophical in nature. How do you build something this vast, this precise, when the individual pieces are too large to move easily from one place to another? The A380 was not manufactured in a single factory. Its components were made across several countries, in Britain and France, in Germany and Spain, each nation contributing pieces of the enormous puzzle. The wings themselves were largely built in the United Kingdom, and once completed, they had to travel across land and sea to reach the final assembly line in Toulouse, in the south of France. These were not parts that could simply be loaded onto an ordinary truck. They were so immense that entire logistics networks had to be reimagined around them. Consider what that actually meant in practice. Enormous ships were used to carry the finished wings along coastlines and up rivers, and specially designed barges and oversized road vehicles moved them the final stretch through the French countryside. In some places, roads had to be widened, roundabouts reshaped, and villages carefully navigated in the dead of night so that these gargantuan pieces could pass through without harm. Picture a colossal wing, longer than most buildings are tall, gliding slowly through a quiet town under floodlights while residents watched from their windows. It was a spectacle in itself, a reminder that building the largest passenger aircraft in the world was not only a matter of engineering, but of extraordinary coordination across an entire continent. The wing was a triumph before it ever left the ground, simply for having arrived at all. And once those wings were joined to the fuselage, something quietly magical happened to the aircraft's identity. The A380 gained its unmistakable silhouette, that broad, confident shape that anyone who has seen it never quite forgets. The wings sweep back at a graceful angle, wide and generous, giving the plane a sense of stability that you can almost feel just by looking at it. Where some aircraft appear sleek and darting, the A380 seems calm and assured, a machine in no hurry, comfortable with its own enormous presence. Those wings are a large part of why it looks the way it does, why it commands attention at any airport, why passengers so often pause on the tarmac just to take in its scale before stepping aboard. There is a deeper reason those wings were made so large, and it connects to the smoothness of the flight you experience within. A bigger wing spreads the aircraft's weight across a greater area of air, which means it can fly more gently with less strain, especially during the delicate moments of takeoff and landing. The immense surface allows the plane to lift off at lower speeds than you might expect for something so heavy, and it lets the aircraft settle back toward the runway with a softness that belies its mass. Passengers often describe the landing of an A380 as surprisingly gentle, as though the plane simply decided to stop flying and rest upon the ground. That gentleness is no accident. It is the direct gift of these vast wings, doing exactly what they were designed to do, carrying you down as tenderly as they carried you up. The wings also housed a hidden purpose that few travelers ever think about. Inside their structure, sealed away from view, sat enormous quantities of fuel, tucked into tanks within the wing itself. This clever arrangement served two graceful ends at once. It kept the heavy fuel spread out along the very structure that generated lift, helping to balance the aircraft, and it placed the weight exactly where the wing was strongest and best able to carry it. As the flight progressed and the fuel was slowly consumed, the wings would gradually lighten, subtly changing the way they flexed and behaved. In a sense, the wing was alive with the rhythm of the journey, growing lighter mile by mile, quietly adapting to every hour spent aloft. So when you next find yourself imagining this aircraft rising into the sky, let your thoughts rest for a moment on those wings. Picture them stretching out into the light, enormous yet delicate, strong yet forgiving, bending softly as they cradle hundreds of people through the thin, cold air miles above the earth. Every curve of them was calculated, every layer chosen with care, every meter of their span the result of thousands of hours of patient human thought. They are not simply a means of flight. They are the reason this giant could ever leave the ground at all, and the reason it did so with such quiet dignity. There is something deeply reassuring in that, in knowing that so much attention and craft went into keeping the ride steady and calm. Let that reassurance settle over you now, as steady and wide as the wings themselves, holding you gently as we drift onward into the rest of this long and peaceful story. Two full decks running the entire length of the fuselage, one stacked neatly above the other, joined by graceful staircases at the front and rear. This was the heart of what made the A380 unlike anything that had come before it. Every other passenger jet in the sky offered a single main floor, a long tube where people sat in rows and glanced down the aisle toward a distant curtain. The A380 quietly rewrote that expectation. It gave you a building in the air, a structure with an upstairs and a downstairs, a place where you could climb a staircase in the middle of a flight and feel, for just a moment, as though you were moving between the floors of a hotel rather than the sections of an aircraft. You might think that a plane with two decks is simply a plane with more seats, and in the plainest sense that is true. But the real secret is what those two decks did to the feeling of space, to the sense of what an airplane could be. On a single-deck aircraft, the designers must cram everything into one tube. The wider they make it, the harder it becomes to support and to fly. There is always a tension between how much floor they want and how heavy the roof above it must be. The A380 solved that tension in the most elegant way imaginable. Instead of stretching outward, it stacked upward, folding a second complete world on top of the first, and in doing so it nearly doubled the floor available without simply making the plane longer and longer until it became impossible to handle on the ground. Picture what that meant for the people inside. On the lower deck, the cabin was remarkably wide enough that 10 seats could sit side by side with two generous aisles between them, and still the ceiling arched overhead with room to spare. There was no cramped, curved feeling near the windows, no sense of the walls pressing inward as they sometimes do on smaller jets. Instead, the space felt open and rectangular, almost like a comfortable room that happened to be moving through the sky. And then, above that, the upper deck offered a quieter, more intimate world, narrower but no less spacious, often reserved for premium travelers, with the gentle curve of the fuselage tucked away behind clever paneling so that even the edges of the cabin felt smooth and calm. Here is where the design became something more than clever engineering. It became an invitation. With two decks to work with, the airlines suddenly had room to dream. They no longer had to treat every square meter as precious cargo to be filled with seats. They could set aside space for things that had once seemed impossible aboard an aircraft. Some airlines built lounges where passengers could stand and stretch, order a drink, and speak with one another away from their seats. Others installed private suites with sliding doors, small enclosed rooms in the sky where a traveler could close themselves away, and sleep in genuine privacy. There were even showers, real showers with warm running water, tucked into the forward section of the upper deck, offering weary, long-haul passengers the almost unbelievable luxury of stepping out refreshed after crossing half the world. None of this would have been possible without those two decks. On a single-floor plane, every one of these ideas competes directly with paying seats, and there is only so much room to go around. But the A380 had generosity built into its very bones. It had so much floor, so much volume, that airlines could afford to be lavish, to carve out corners for comfort and wonder, rather than filling every inch with rows. That is why stepping aboard an A380 so often felt different from boarding any other flight. There was breathing room. There was the quiet luxury of space itself, which on a crowded planet has become one of the rarest luxuries of all. Think for a moment about the simple act of walking through the aircraft. On most planes, you enter through a single door and immediately find yourself in the one long cabin, and that is the whole of your world until you land. Aboard the A380, you might step in and be greeted not by rows, but by a foyer, an open entrance area that felt almost like a lobby. From there, a curving staircase might rise before you, sweeping gently upward to the second floor. And there is something about a staircase inside an airplane that stirs a particular kind of delight. It seems to belong to solid ground, to buildings rooted firmly on the earth, and to find one here thousands of meters up, gliding through the cold, thin air, gives the whole experience a dreamlike quality. Passengers would climb those stairs and feel, quite genuinely, that they were exploring a place rather than simply enduring a journey. That feeling of exploration, of freedom to move and to discover, was perhaps the greatest gift of the double deck. Long flights can feel confining, hour after hour spent in a single seat with the same view of the same seat back before you. But the A380 offered somewhere to go. You could rise from your chair, walk to a staircase, ascend to another level, find a lounge or a bar, or simply a different stretch of aisle to stroll along, and in doing so break the monotony that so often settles over long-distance travel. The plane gave you the sense that you were not trapped, that there was more to the space than the small rectangle you had been assigned, and that quiet reassurance did wonders for the spirit on a flight that might last 12 or 14 hours. Consider too what the two decks meant for light and for openness. With so much internal volume, designers could raise ceilings, widen aisles, and shape the cabins to feel airy rather than enclosed. Mood lighting could wash across broad expanses of ceiling, shifting softly through the colors of a sunrise or a twilight, and because the spaces were larger, that light had room to spread and glow. The whole interior could be sculpted into something that felt less like the inside of a machine and more like a serene, carefully composed environment, a place designed not merely to transport you, but to soothe you along the way. It helps to hold the contrast clearly in your mind. Imagine the typical wide-body jet, itself a marvel, carrying a few hundred people across oceans in a single long cabin. It is a splendid thing, and generations of travelers have crossed the world within its walls. Yet it remains, in the end, one floor, one tube, one continuous line of seats. Now set the A380 beside it. Here is that same journey, but with the cabin lifted and doubled, with a second complete floor floating above the first, with staircases and lounges and suites and showers, with room to walk and to breathe and to feel, however briefly, that you had escaped the ordinary confines of flight. The difference is not merely one of size, it is a difference of experience, of possibility, of the very idea of what it means to travel through the air. And so the double deck stands as one of the truest expressions of what the A380 was meant to be. It was never simply about carrying more people, though it did that with ease. It was about reimagining the space in which those people would sit, sleep, walk, and dream during their long hours aloft. It was about taking the cramped, familiar tube of air travel and turning it into something generous, something almost architectural, a vessel with floors and stairs and rooms, a small world lifted whole into the sky. Few aircraft before it had ever attempted such a thing on such a scale, and none had done it with quite this grace. So, as you rest here, let your mind wander gently through those two great floors, up the sweeping staircase and along the wide, bright aisles, past the quiet suites and the softly glowing lounges, through a cabin so spacious it hardly feels like flying at all. Picture the calm of moving freely within a plane, of having somewhere to go, of space enough to breathe. There is a deep peace in that image, in a machine so vast and thoughtful that it made room for comfort itself. Let that peace carry you onward, gently, as our long and quiet story drifts on toward what comes next. Beneath each vast wing of the A380 hung two enormous engines, four in all, and together they were tasked with something that borders on the miraculous. They had to lift into the air a machine that could weigh, when fully loaded with passengers and cargo and fuel, well over 1,000,000 pounds. Think about that number for a moment as you rest here. More than 1,000,000 pounds of metal and people and possessions, rising smoothly off the runway and climbing into the sky, held aloft by nothing but shaped air and the steady, patient force of those four great engines working in quiet harmony. To understand what those engines had to accomplish, it helps to picture the moment of takeoff itself. The aircraft sits at the end of the runway, heavy and still, the largest passenger jet ever to fly. The pilots push the throttles forward and the engines begin to spool up. What follows is not a violent lurch, but a gathering, a building of power that pushes the plane forward with growing confidence. Each of those four engines could produce somewhere in the region of 70,000 pounds of thrust, and when you add them all together, you arrive at a combined force that stretches the imagination. It is enough to accelerate that colossal weight down the runway and lift it gently free of the earth, as though the whole thing had suddenly remembered it was never meant to stay grounded. Now here is where the story grows more interesting, because the A380 did not come with only one kind of engine. When Airbus designed the aircraft, they offered airlines a choice, and that choice fell between two very different families of engines, each built by a different consortium of engineering minds. On one side stood the Rolls-Royce Trent 900, a product of that famous British firm whose name has long been associated with precision and quiet excellence. On the other side stood the Engine Alliance GP 7200, a joint creation born from the partnership of two American giants, General Electric and Pratt & Whitney, who came together specifically to build a power plant worthy of this enormous new plane. The existence of that choice tells you something rather lovely about how the aviation world works. An airline purchasing the A380 could decide which engines suited its needs, its maintenance networks, its existing fleets, and its own quiet preferences. Some carriers leaned toward the Rolls-Royce Trent 900, drawn to its heritage and its particular character. Others chose the Engine Alliance GP 7200, favoring its own blend of efficiency and reliability. Both engines had to meet the same demanding standard, which was simply to lift the largest airliner in the world and carry it across oceans day after day without complaint. and both in their own ways rose magnificently to that challenge. Consider first the Rolls-Royce Trent 900. It belonged to a long and distinguished line of Trent engines, a family whose design philosophy had been refined across decades of service on other wide-body jets. At the front sat an enormous fan, nearly 10 feet across, spinning to draw in vast quantities of air. But here is the secret that so many people miss about a modern jet engine like this one. Most of the air pulled in by that great fan does not actually pass through the fiery heart of the engine at all. Instead, it flows around the core, bypassing the combustion entirely, and it is this bypassing air that provides most of the thrust. The arrangement is called a high bypass turbofan, and it is the reason these engines could be so powerful and yet so remarkably efficient and quiet. The Trent 900 carried within it a beautiful architecture of 3 separate spinning shafts, nested one inside another, each turning at its own ideal speed. This 3-shaft design was a hallmark of the Rolls-Royce approach, allowing every part of the engine to rotate at the pace that suited it best, rather than being forced to compromise. The great fan turned slowly and steadily, while deeper inside the smaller compressors and turbines spun far faster, squeezing and heating the air before igniting it with fuel in a controlled and continuous burn. From that burning came the energy that drove everything, the hot gases rushing out the back and, more importantly, keeping all those shafts turning so the fan could keep pulling in its gentle river of air. The Engine Alliance GP7200 approached the same task from a slightly different direction, drawing on the combined wisdom of 2 of America's most experienced engine makers. Its core was derived from proven technology already flying reliably on other aircraft, blended with a large and efficient fan of its own. Rather than 3 shafts, it used a 2-shaft configuration, a different engineering choice that reflected the traditions of its makers, yet it achieved the same essential goal. It too pulled in enormous volumes of air, sent most of it flowing around the core, and produced the tremendous thrust needed to move the A380 through the sky. Both engines, though built on different philosophies, converged on the same quiet triumph. What makes these machines so astonishing is not merely their power, but the sophistication hidden within them. Inside each engine, temperatures in the hottest sections could soar far beyond the point at which ordinary metal would simply melt away. To survive this, engineers crafted the turbine blades from exotic materials, from single crystals of superalloy grown with extraordinary care, so that they had no weak boundaries within them. These blades were then hollowed out and threaded with tiny cooling passages so that cooler air could flow through them and form a thin protective film across their surfaces. In this way, a blade could sit in a stream of gas, hotter than its own melting point, and yet spin on thousands of times a minute, hour after hour, flight after flight, without failing. There is something deeply reassuring in that thought as you drift here in the calm. Every element of these engines was designed with layers upon layers of care. The fans were balanced with exquisite precision. The blades were monitored and modeled and tested until their behavior was understood in the smallest detail. Sensors throughout the engine watched over temperatures and pressures and vibrations, quietly reporting their findings, so that the engine effectively kept watch over its own health as it flew. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was measured, refined, and proven, because the task these engines performed was so vital and so continuous. And yet, for all this immense power and complexity, perhaps the most remarkable quality of the A380's engines was how gentle they seemed from within the cabin. You might expect that 4 engines lifting 1,000,000 pounds would fill the aircraft with a deafening roar, but the opposite was true. The A380 was famously one of the quietest large jets ever to carry passengers. Much of this owed to those high bypass fans whose slow-moving outer streams of air produced far less noise than the harsh screaming exhausts of older designs. The engines whispered rather than shouted, and inside the cabin you might hear little more than a soft, steady hush, a background murmur so smooth it faded easily into the edges of awareness. This is the quiet power that defined those four engines. They possessed strength almost beyond comprehension, enough to hurl the heaviest of airliners into the sky and hold it there for 14 hours across the widest oceans. And yet they carried that strength with grace and restraint. They did not announce themselves. They simply worked endlessly and faithfully, their great fans turning, their hidden cores burning, their cooled blades spinning in temperatures that would destroy lesser things, all so that the passengers above could sit in comfort and hardly notice the tremendous forces at play just beyond the cabin walls. So as you rest here, let your mind settle for a moment on those four engines hanging beneath the wings, each one a masterpiece of quiet engineering. Picture the smooth flow of air passing through them, the balanced spin of their enormous fans, the steady hush they made as they carried their vast charge across the night sky. There is a profound calm in knowing that such power could be so gentle, that so much force could be tamed into a soft and reliable whisper. Let that thought carry you onward, easy and untroubled, as our quiet journey through this remarkable aircraft continues to drift gently forward. Step into the forward section of the upper deck on certain A380s, and you would have found something that no airliner had ever offered before. Not a row of seats, not a cramped galley, a bar, a real, gleaming, curving bar, complete with polished surfaces, softly glowing panels, stools where you could rest, and shelves lined with bottles and glasses. Somewhere over the middle of an ocean, 37,000 feet above the dark water, you could rise from your seat, walk a short distance, and order a drink from a smiling attendant standing behind a counter, as though you had wandered into a quiet lounge in some distant city, rather than a machine hurtling through the thin cold air. It is a strange and wonderful thing to picture, and it captures perfectly what the A380 made possible. The secret, of course, was space. All that vast floor area we spoke of earlier, those two full decks running the entire length of the aircraft, gave the airlines room to dream. On a smaller plane, every square foot must be defended fiercely, because each one either holds a paying passenger or it does not. But the A380 was so enormous that even after packing in hundreds of seats, there was still room left over, room to spare, room to play with. And into that room the airlines poured their imaginations, each one trying to outdo the others, each one turning a portion of the cabin into something extraordinary. Emirates was perhaps the most famous of them all for this. Their onboard lounge, tucked into the rear of the upper deck, became a signature of the airline. Business and first-class travelers could leave their seats, wander back, and settle into a comfortable social space with curved seating, warm lighting, and that celebrated bar. People gathered there. They talked, they laughed quietly. They watched the moving map show their slow progress across the world. For a few hours, flying stopped being something you simply endured and became something you might actually enjoy, even savor. And that shift, subtle as it sounds, was quietly revolutionary. Then there were the showers. Yes, showers in the sky. On certain A380s, the very finest first-class suites came with access to a private spa bathroom, where a passenger could actually stand beneath a stream of warm water while cruising far above the clouds. Think for a moment about what that required. Water had to be carried aloft, heated, and delivered under pressure, all within the tight weight limits of an aircraft where every extra kilogram costs fuel. Engineers allotted each shower a carefully measured amount of water, timed to the second, so that a traveler could freshen up midway through a long journey and step out feeling renewed. To board a plane tired and rumpled, and to step off it clean and refreshed as though you had never left the ground, was an experience earlier generations of flyers could scarcely have imagined. And beyond the bars and the showers lay the suites themselves, the crown jewels of the A380 cabin. These were not seats in any ordinary sense. They were small private rooms, enclosed by tall walls and sliding doors, giving the traveler a genuine sense of seclusion. Inside you might find a plush armchair that transformed into a fully flat bed, dressed with proper linens and a soft pillow. There were personal wardrobes, vanity mirrors, minibars stocked to your liking, and wide screens for entertainment. Some suites were designed so that partners traveling together could lower a divider between them and share the space, turning two private rooms into one. It was in every meaningful way a tiny hotel room drifting through the stratosphere. What makes all this so remarkable is not simply that it existed, but that the A380 alone had the sheer size to make it practical. Other aircraft had tried premium cabins, of course, and some offered beautiful seats, but the A380 offered volume, and volume changes everything. With two decks to work with, an airline could dedicate an entire portion of the aircraft to just a handful of ultra-premium travelers, giving each of them an almost absurd amount of personal room, while still carrying hundreds of others below. The economics that would have crippled a smaller plane simply worked here, because there was space enough for both the dreamers up front and the crowds behind them. And so the airlines competed, each carving the interior in its own image. Singapore Airlines built lavish enclosed suites of exquisite finish, with fine leather and hand-stitched details. Etihad went further still, creating what they called the residence, a 3-room private apartment aboard the aircraft, complete with a living room, a separate bedroom with a real double bed, and an ensuite bathroom, all served by a dedicated butler trained at a famous butler academy. Imagine that. A single passenger aboard a plane carrying 500 souls, sleeping in a private bedroom while a personal attendant sees to their every wish. It sounds almost like a fantasy, and yet it flew night after night across the world's longest routes. This freedom to customize was itself a gift of the design. Because the fuselage was so wide and the decks so long, airlines could arrange the interior in countless configurations. One carrier might fill the plane with more than 800 economy seats for busy pilgrimage routes, packing in as many travelers as the rules would allow. Another might install barely 500 seats, lavishing the remaining space on lounges, suites, and open areas. The same aircraft, the same aluminum shell, and the same 4 great engines could be a democratic people mover or a flying palace, depending entirely on the vision of the airline that owned it. Few machines in history have been so willing to become whatever their owners desired. All of this began to reshape what passengers expected from air travel. For decades, flying had been something to get through. You boarded, you sat, you waited, you arrived. Comfort meant at best a slightly larger seat and a warm meal. But the A380 quietly raised the bar. Once travelers had experienced a lounge in the sky, or stepped out of a shower at altitude, or slept soundly in a private suite, the old idea of simply enduring a flight began to feel like a relic of a poorer age. The plane taught people to expect more. It suggested that the hours spent aloft need not be lost hours, dead time between two places, but could instead be hours worth having in their own right. There is something almost philosophical in that shift, and it is a lovely thing to rest your mind upon as you lie here in the quiet. For most of aviation's history, the journey was merely the price you paid to reach the destination. The whole point was to get somewhere else, and the flight was the obstacle in between. But the A380, with its bars and showers and suites and lounges, gently proposed a different idea. It suggested that the journey itself could be the destination, that the act of flying, done well enough, could become a pleasure to look forward to, rather than a trial to survive, that you might one day board a plane not to escape it as quickly as possible, but to enjoy the rare and peaceful hours it offered you, suspended between the ordinary world you left behind and the one waiting ahead. Picture it now as you drift towards sleep. The soft glow of the onboard bar in the middle of the night, a few travelers murmuring quietly over their drinks, the hush of a private suite with its door slid closed, the bed made up, the reading light dimmed low, the gentle warmth of a shower running as the aircraft slips silently through the dark sky. All of this held aloft by those four whispering engines and those two enormous decks. All of this made possible by the simple fact that someone dared to build a plane large enough to carry not just people, but comfort itself in generous measure. It was luxury redefined, lifted from the ground and set gently among the clouds. And whether or not you ever walked those aisles or rested in those suites, there is a quiet wonder in knowing that such a thing existed, that human beings once built a machine so vast and so kind that it could offer a weary traveler a place to bathe, to rest, and to dream, all while crossing an entire ocean in the deep and peaceful night. Let that gentle image stay with you now, soft and reassuring as our unhurried journey through this remarkable aircraft drifts calmly onward. Long before the first A380 ever touched the runway, it existed only as a dream, a bold idea whispered among engineers who wondered whether it was truly possible to build something so enormous and still make it fly. And it was not a small dream. It was perhaps the largest and most audacious ambition in the history of commercial aviation, a plane conceived not merely to carry more people, but to redefine what an airplane could be. The men and women who imagined it were not content to make something slightly better than what came before. They wanted to make a leap, a bound so great that it would stand alone in the sky, unmatched by anything else that had ever carried passengers across an ocean. The vision was simple to state and staggering to achieve. They wanted the biggest passenger aircraft the world had ever seen, a machine capable of carrying more than 500 souls in comfort over enormous distances, quietly and gracefully. On paper, it was an elegant notion. In practice, it demanded that thousands of engineers solve problems that had never been solved before, that materials be pushed to new limits, that wings be shaped in ways no one had quite dared to shape them. It was the kind of goal that could easily have collapsed under its own weight, and yet the people behind it pressed forward, convinced that the future of flying belonged to those brave enough to build something truly enormous. What makes this story so remarkable is that no single country built the A380. It was, from the very beginning, a shared endeavor, a great collaboration stretched across an entire continent. Europe, with all its many nations and languages and histories, came together to build one machine. Engineers in France drew up plans while their colleagues in Germany refined designs of their own. Factories in England shaped the great wings, those long and graceful structures that would eventually lift 1,000,000 pounds into the air. And in Spain, other pieces of the puzzle took form, each one crafted with the same care and precision as the rest. It was a project that seemed to embody the very idea of nations setting aside their differences to reach for something greater together. There is something quietly moving in that thought, if you let your mind settle on it as you rest. Imagine the sheer coordination it required, the countless conversations across borders, the shared drawings and specifications passed from one country to another, all of it aimed at a single vision hanging somewhere out on the horizon. Each nation brought its own strengths, its own long traditions of craftsmanship and engineering, and each contributed a vital piece to a whole that none of them could have built alone. The A380 was, in a sense, a monument not just to aviation, but to cooperation itself, to the belief that great things become possible when many hands work toward one purpose. Yet ambition on this scale came with enormous risk, and it would be wrong to imagine that any of it came easily. The money involved was almost impossible to comprehend. Building a brand new aircraft from scratch, especially one so much larger than anything before it, required an investment measured in the billions upon billions. Vast sums were poured into research, into factories, into tooling and testing, and the slow, careful work of turning drawings into reality. Every one of those dollars represented a gamble, a bet placed on the belief that the world would want such a plane, that airlines would buy it, that passengers would fill it. If the dream failed, the losses would be catastrophic. It was, in truth, one of the largest financial risks ever taken in the history of manufacturing, a wager of extraordinary boldness placed on the future of flight. But the people behind the A380 believed, and they staked everything on that belief. They looked at the growing world, at the rising number of travelers, at the crowded airports and the busy skies, and they saw a future in which a plane this large would not only make sense, but would become essential. They imagined great hub airports where enormous aircraft would gather crowds of passengers and carry them onward across the oceans in a single graceful sweep. It was a vision of the sky reshaped, of travel made grander and more efficient, and they were willing to spend fortunes and take years of patient effort to bring it into being. And then there was the sheer logistical wonder of actually assembling the thing. Here we arrive at one of the most extraordinary parts of the whole story, a detail so surprising that it is worth savoring slowly in the quiet. Because the components of the A380 were built in different countries scattered across Europe, they somehow had to be brought together in one place to be assembled into a finished aircraft. And these were not small parts you could simply load onto an ordinary truck. These were sections of fuselage as wide as a house, wings longer than a football field, pieces so vast that moving them became a challenge in itself. So they built a journey for the parts. The great sections of the aircraft traveled by sea, loaded onto specially designed ships that carried them across the water toward France. From there, they moved along rivers on enormous barges, drifting slowly through the European countryside like some strange and wonderful procession. And then, at last, they were placed on specially built road convoys that traveled at night through small towns and narrow country lanes, roads that in some cases had to be widened and reshaped simply to allow these colossal pieces to pass. Villagers would sometimes wake to see the great components rolling silently through their streets in the darkness, guided by teams of workers, inching their way toward the final assembly line. Picture that gentle scene now as you rest. The enormous wing of an airplane, wrapped and secured, moving slowly through a sleeping village in the middle of the night, the roads cleared and quiet, the whole operation carried out with the care of moving something precious and irreplaceable. It took extraordinary planning to make it happen, months and years of preparation to ensure that every piece arrived where it needed to be, in perfect condition, ready to be joined with the others. And when all of those pieces finally came together in the great assembly hall, one of the largest buildings in the world, they slowly formed the shape of the biggest passenger plane ever made. There is a real beauty in imagining that hall, vast enough to hold several of these giants at once, with cranes and gantries reaching overhead and the wings arriving from England, the fuselage from Germany and France, the tail and other pieces from Spain, all of it converging into one enormous gleaming whole. It was a place where the dream became solid, where drawings and ambitions turned into aluminum and steel, where the collaboration of many nations took physical form before the eyes of the people who had made it possible. To stand there and watch an A380 slowly take shape must have felt like witnessing something close to a miracle of human effort. And behind all of it, beneath the money and the logistics and the engineering, was something simpler and more human still. It was determination. The pure, stubborn refusal to accept that some things are simply too big, too hard, too ambitious to attempt. The A380 existed because a great many people decided that the boundaries of what was possible in aviation should be pushed just a little further. And then further still, they chose to reach for something enormous, knowing the risks, knowing the difficulties, and they poured years of their lives into making it real. That kind of determination is a beautiful thing to reflect upon, a reminder of what we are capable of when we dare to dream on a grand scale. So as you lie here, drifting gently towards sleep, let your mind rest upon that image of ambition made real. Think of the ships and the barges and the quiet night convoys, of the wings crossing seas and rivers, of the great hall where a continent's worth of craftsmanship came together into a single flying machine. Think of the sheer courage it took to imagine such a plane and the patient effort it took to build it. It is a soothing thought in its way that human beings can dream so boldly and work so carefully to bring those dreams into the sky. And it is a lovely thing to carry with you as our calm journey drifts onward through the peaceful dark. Step aboard an A380 in flight, close the cabin door behind you, and the first thing you notice is not what you hear, but what you do not. There is a hush here, a softness in the air that feels almost impossible for a machine this large. You are sitting inside a structure that weighs hundreds of tons, propelled through the sky by 4 enormous engines burning fuel at a tremendous rate, and yet the loudest sound around you might be the gentle rush of the ventilation or the quiet murmur of a fellow passenger settling into a seat nearby. That stillness was no accident. It was one of the great triumphs of the A380, and it is worth resting your mind upon as you drift towards sleep. You might think that a plane so large would be a noisier place than a smaller one, and that seems perfectly reasonable when you first consider it. Bigger engines, more air rushing past a longer body, more of everything. But the reality turned out to be exactly the opposite. The A380 earned a reputation, almost from its very first flights, as one of the quietest passenger cabins ever to fly the skies. Travelers who stepped off the aircraft after a long journey often remarked that they had slept better than they ever expected, that the flight had passed in a kind of gentle blur, that they had barely noticed the hours slipping by. And behind that peaceful experience lay a great deal of careful, patient engineering. Let us think first about where cabin noise even comes from, because understanding that helps you appreciate just how thoroughly the designers tackled it. On any aircraft, the sound you hear has a few main sources. There is the noise of the engines themselves, the roar of combustion, and the whistle of air being pushed through those enormous fans. There is the sound of the air flowing over the skin of the aircraft, a constant rushing pressure that grows with speed, and there is vibration, the subtle trembling that travels through the structure and reaches your seat, your armrest, the floor beneath your feet. Each of these had to be understood, measured, and softened, and the people who built the A380 approached every one of them with remarkable attention. The engines were the natural place to begin. As you may recall, the A380 used high bypass turbofans, either the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 or the Engine Alliance GP 7200, and those engines were designed with quietness as a genuine goal, not merely an afterthought. The secret lay in how they moved air. Most of the air that passed through those engines did not go through the fiery core at all. Instead, it flowed around it, a great cushioning stream of slower, cooler air wrapping around the hot, fast exhaust at the center. When these two flows met and mixed at the back of the engine, the difference in their speeds was gentler than in older designs, and that gentler blending produced far less noise. It is a little like the difference between a garden hose blasting at full pressure and a wide, soft flow of water spreading calmly outward. The energy is still there, but the harshness is smoothed away, and there was more to it than the flow of air alone. The engineers gave careful thought to the very edges of the engine components, shaping them in ways that broke up and softened the sound before it could escape. The mountings that held those engines to the wings were designed to absorb vibration rather than pass it along into the structure. Every connection, every joint, every surface was an opportunity to catch a little of that trembling energy and quiet it before it reached you. So by the time the sound of those four great engines made its way toward the cabin, much of its sharpness had already been gently taken away. But the engines were only part of the story, and here is where the real magic of the cabin begins. The interior itself was wrapped in layers of insulation, blankets of sound-absorbing material tucked between the outer skin of the aircraft and the panels you actually see and touch. These layers worked like the soft padding in a recording studio, soaking up sound waves before they could bounce around and reach your ears. The windows were built with multiple panes and carefully considered gaps, another barrier against the rushing world outside. Even the way the cabin panels themselves were fitted together was chosen to prevent the little rattles and hums that can build up over a long flight into a wearying background drone. There is something almost tender about that level of care when you stop to think about it. Somewhere, engineers sat and measured the precise frequencies of sound that human beings find most tiring, most irritating over the course of many hours, and then they set about designing the aircraft to muffle exactly those tones. They understood that a long flight is not merely about arriving safely, it is about how you feel when you arrive, whether you step off the plane frayed and exhausted or calm and rested. And so they treated quietness not as a luxury but as a genuine gift to the traveler, a form of comfort woven invisibly into every wall and floor. The sheer size of the A380 actually helped in this quiet pursuit, which is one of those lovely surprises hidden in the design. Because the cabin was so vast, the engines could be mounted farther out along those enormous wings, placing their noise at a greater distance from where the passengers sat. There was more room, too, for all that insulation, more space between you and the outside world. The great double-deck body did not press its passengers close against the roaring skin of the aircraft. Instead, it held them in a generous, cushioned interior, buffered on all sides by structure and space and carefully chosen materials. What might have been a disadvantage, all that size, became instead a source of serenity. Now compare this to the other great aircraft of its time, and the achievement stands out even more clearly. The Boeing 747, that famous queen of the skies, was a marvel in its own right and a quieter plane than many. Yet passengers who traveled on both often noticed that the A380 carried a deeper stillness. The newer generation of engines, the fresh insulation techniques, the lessons learned across decades of aviation, all of it came together in the A380 to push the level of cabin quietness further than the large jets that had come before. Where older aircraft delivered a steady, ever-present hum that you simply learned to tolerate, the A380 offered something closer to silence, a peacefulness that let conversation flow at a normal volume and let sleep come easily. Imagine that for a moment as you rest here in the dark. You are cruising far above the ocean in the middle of a long night flight, and the cabin lights have been dimmed to a soft glow. All around you, people are sleeping reclined in their seats or stretched out in their private suites, and the whole aircraft is wrapped in a gentle quiet. The engines are working tirelessly out on those great wings, carrying you steadily toward your destination, and yet you can barely hear them. There is only a soft, warm hush, a sense of being cradled high above the world, safe and calm and undisturbed. That was the experience the A380 was built to give, and it is a beautiful thing to picture as your own eyes grow heavy. For the airlines, this quietness became a point of quiet pride, something they knew their passengers would feel even if they could not quite explain it. People would describe their A380 journeys as restful and pleasant, without always understanding why, sensing only that the flight had treated them kindly, and that in the end is the truest measure of good design. When something works so well that you do not even notice it, when the effort disappears entirely into the comfort it provides, that is when the engineers have truly succeeded. The silence of the A380 was the sound of countless problems quietly solved, of noise gently defeated, of care made real in aluminum and fabric and foam. So let that soothing thought settle over you now. A machine of astonishing size, moving through the heavens with barely a whisper, carrying its passengers through the long dark hours in a bubble of calm. There is a deep reassurance in the idea that something so powerful could also be so peaceful, that human cleverness could tame not only the forces of flight, but the very sound of it. Rest in that stillness for a while, and let the quiet of the great aircraft carry you gently onward, deeper into sleep, as our tranquil journey drifts along beneath the soft and endless stars. While the A380 was climbing to its cruising heights and lulling its passengers into contented sleep, something quieter and far more consequential was happening down on the ground. The world of aviation, the very world that had asked for a plane like this, was slowly beginning to change its mind. It was not a sudden shift, not a single dramatic moment. It was more like a tide, moving in gently at first, so gradual that few noticed until the water had already reached their feet. And that tide would come to shape the fate of the largest passenger aircraft ever built. To understand what was happening, you have to picture the assumptions the A380 was born from. When Airbus first imagined this enormous machine, the thinking went something like this. The great cities of the world, the London and the Tokyo and the New York, would only grow busier and more crowded. The big airports serving them had a limited number of takeoff and landing slots, and those slots would only become more precious as passenger numbers climbed year after year. So the logic seemed unshakable. If you cannot add more flights, you simply make each flight carry more people. Fill the sky with fewer, larger aircraft, each one moving 500 or more passengers at a time, and you solve the problem of a crowded world. It was elegant, it was bold, and for a time it felt inevitable. But quietly, in engineering offices and airline boardrooms, a different vision was taking hold. And this is where the story turns, because the answer that seemed so obvious was about to be challenged by something smaller, leaner, and remarkably clever. The heart of that challenge came from a new generation of twin-engine aircraft. For most of aviation history, there had been a comforting rule that the longest routes, the ones that crossed vast oceans, should be flown by aircraft with 3 or 4 engines. The reasoning was simple enough. If you were hours away from the nearest runway out over the empty water, you wanted the reassurance of extra engines in case one failed. 2 engines felt too risky for those endless stretches of sea, and so the biggest, longest journeys belonged to the giants, the 4-engine machines like the 747 and, in time, the A380 itself. Yet engines had been getting better, steadily and relentlessly, for decades. They had grown more reliable, more powerful, and far more efficient than anyone in earlier years might have dreamed. A modern jet engine could run for astonishing lengths of time without trouble, and the odds of failure had shrunk to something vanishingly small. Regulators took notice, and slowly they extended the permissions that allowed twin-engine planes to fly further and further from any diversion airport. What had once been forbidden became routine. A plane with just 2 engines could now cross the widest oceans with complete confidence, hour after hour, with all the safety anyone could ask for. This changed everything, though it took time for the full weight of it to be felt. Suddenly, the airlines had a new kind of choice. They could reach for a smaller twin-engine aircraft, one carrying perhaps 250 or 300 passengers, and fly it directly across the world on routes that once demanded a giant. And because these planes burned so much less fuel and cost so much less to buy and maintain, they offered a kind of freedom the great 4-engine machines could never match. The revolution was not louder engines or bigger wings. It was efficiency wrapped in flexibility. And with that flexibility came a shift in the very shape of how people travel. For years, the dominant model had been what planners called the hub and spoke system. Picture a great wheel with a busy central airport at its heart, the hub, and lines radiating outward like spokes to smaller cities all around. Under this model, if you wanted to fly from a modest city on one continent to a modest city on another, you would first take a short flight to a major hub, then board an enormous aircraft for the long crossing to a hub on the far side, and finally catch another small flight onward to your true destination. The giant planes lived on those middle legs, the trunk routes between the great hubs, gathering passengers from many spokes and carrying them together in one massive load. The A380 was designed precisely for this world, to be the mighty vessel at the center of the wheel. But travelers, if you ask them, rarely want to change planes. They want to go straight from where they are to where they are going, without the long wait in a crowded terminal, without the anxiety of a missed connection, without the extra hours added to an already long day. And the new twin-engine aircraft made that dream possible on a scale never seen before. Instead of funneling everyone through a handful of enormous hubs, airlines could now open direct routes between smaller cities that had never before been connected. This was the rise of point-to-point travel, and it fit the way people actually wanted to move through the world. Why fly through a distant hub when a smaller, efficient plane could take you straight there? You can feel the appeal of it even now, lying here in the quiet. The simplicity of a single flight, one takeoff and one landing, a straight line drawn from home to destination. It is a gentler kind of journey, and the airlines understood that gentleness sold tickets. So more and more of them began to favor these nimble twins over the great giants, spreading their flights across many routes rather than concentrating everything on a few enormous ones. And there was another force gathering strength through all of this, one that pressed harder with each passing year: the cost of fuel. An aircraft like the A380 drank enormous quantities of it, and while it was remarkably efficient when every seat was filled, that was precisely the catch. Every seat had to be filled. A plane built for 500 passengers only made economic sense when 500 passengers actually showed up, flight after flight, day after day. If the seats went empty, the giant became a burden, hauling its own vast weight through the sky at tremendous expense. The smaller twins carried far less risk. It was simply easier to fill 200 seats than 500, easier to match the size of the aircraft to the true demand of the route. When fuel prices climbed, as they did in waves over these years, the arithmetic grew even more merciless. Airlines watched their costs rise and looked hard at the numbers on every route, and the numbers increasingly whispered the same thing. The efficient twins were kinder to the balance sheet. They asked for less and forgave more, and in a business built on thin margins, that mattered more than grandeur ever could. Beyond the money, another concern was beginning to stir in the wider world, a growing awareness of the skies not just as a place to fly, but as something to protect. People were paying closer attention to the fuel that aviation burned and the emissions it left behind. The conversation about the environment was becoming louder, and airlines sensed that the future would reward those who could carry passengers with the lightest possible footprint. A brand new fuel-sipping twin-engine aircraft was easier to celebrate than a thirsty four-engine giant, and that perception, fair or not, would only grow more important with time. So picture it now, this quiet convergence of forces, all arriving together like weather building on a distant horizon. Engines that had grown so reliable they freed the twins to fly anywhere. Travelers who wanted to go directly rather than through crowded hubs. Fuel that grew expensive and demanded efficiency above all, and a rising sense that the cleaner, leaner aircraft was the aircraft of tomorrow. None of these things was aimed at the A380 on purpose. There was no villain in this story, no single decision to turn against the great plane. It was simply the world changing its shape around a machine that had been designed for a different world. And that is the gentle irony resting at the heart of the A380's tale. It was one of the finest aircraft ever built, a triumph of engineering and comfort and human ambition, and yet it arrived just as the ground beneath it began quietly to shift. The very logic that had called it into being, the belief in ever larger planes serving ever busier hubs, was being softly undone by the rise of something smaller and more flexible. The giant was magnificent, but the tide was turning, and in the chapters of aviation history that were still to come, that turning tide would ask hard questions of the largest passenger plane the world had ever known. For now, though, let that thought rest lightly. The story is far from over, and there is still much wonder to drift through together beneath the calm and endless night. Every time an A380 pushed back from the gate, it carried with it a quiet, invisible burden that had nothing to do with passengers or luggage. It carried the weight of its own appetite. 4 engines, each one a marvel of engineering, together drank fuel at a rate that could take your breath away. A single long-haul flight might see the giant swallow well over 300,000 liters of jet fuel, and that fuel, on many days, was the single largest line on the airline's ledger for that route. You could design the most beautiful cabin in the world, fill it with showers and lounges and suites, But none of that changed the simple truth waiting on the runway. This was a machine that needed to burn an enormous amount of energy just to lift itself off the ground. And here is where the story grows quietly complicated, because burning fuel was only the beginning. Think for a moment about everything else the A380 asked for. It needed more of almost everything. More oil, more tires, more brake systems, more hydraulic fluid, more of the countless small components that keep an aircraft flying safely. It had more engines to inspect, more turbine blades to monitor, more landing gear to service. Every one of those systems came with its own schedule of maintenance, its own team of engineers, its own cost. The plane was magnificent precisely because it was so large, and yet that same size meant that keeping it healthy demanded more hands, more hours, and more money than almost anything else in the sky. There is a gentle rule in aviation that the more parts a machine has, the more attention it will eventually require, and the A380 embodied that rule on a grand scale. Consider those 4 engines again. Each one was a masterpiece, reliable and quiet and powerful, but each one still had to be maintained and eventually overhauled at tremendous expense. A twin-engine aircraft flying a similar route only had to care for 2. That difference, repeated across a whole fleet, across years of flying, added up to sums that airline accountants could not ignore. The giant asked more of its keepers simply by being what it was. But the deepest challenge, the one that sat at the very center of the A380's difficulties, was not really about maintenance at all. It was about those 500 and more seats and the simple, stubborn problem of filling them. Picture the arithmetic that an airline had to solve. To justify flying such a large aircraft, the seats had to be occupied, not on a single lucky day but consistently, week after week, season after season. On the busiest, most glamorous routes between the world's great cities, this could work beautifully. The demand was there. The travelers arrived, and the giant flew full and proud. Yet those perfect routes were rarer than the early dreams had imagined. For most journeys, filling 500 seats over and over was an enormous ask. Travel demand rises and falls like the tide. It surges in the holiday seasons and quiets in the shoulder months. It swells on certain days of the week and thins on others. A smaller aircraft could ride those changing currents with grace, matching its size to the moment. But the A380 could not shrink itself when demand dipped. It flew at full size regardless, and when the seats went empty, those empty seats became pure loss. The airline still paid to lift them into the sky, still burned the fuel to carry them across the ocean, and received nothing in return. An empty seat on a small plane is a small disappointment. An empty seat on the largest plane ever built, multiplied by dozens on a quiet day, becomes a serious wound to the balance sheet. And so airlines found themselves walking a narrow and often uncomfortable line. To make the giant profitable, they needed near-perfect occupancy, and near-perfect occupancy is one of the hardest things to achieve in all of commercial aviation. Some carriers responded by concentrating their A380s on only their strongest routes, the handful of golden corridors where the crowds reliably appeared. That worked, up to a point, but it also meant the aircraft could not be used flexibly. It was a specialist, brilliant in its niche but awkward everywhere else, and specialists are expensive to keep when the world prefers versatility. Now let us step off the aircraft entirely and look at the ground it needed, because even that presented a quiet obstacle. The A380 was so large that many airports simply could not accommodate it without spending a great deal of money first. Its wingspan stretched nearly 80 meters, wide enough that taxiways and gates had to be reconsidered. Its two full decks meant that boarding a full load of passengers efficiently required special jet bridges, sometimes two or even three connecting to a single aircraft at once. Its sheer weight demanded runways and taxiways strong enough to bear it. Airports that wanted to welcome the giant had to invest in wider taxi lanes, reinforced pavement, larger gates, and specialized ground equipment. This meant that the A380 could not simply fly anywhere it pleased. It could only land where the ground had been prepared to receive it, and preparing that ground cost airports and governments large sums. Many were willing, especially the great international hubs that saw the giant as a symbol of prestige. But many others were not, and every airport that could not accept the A380 was another door quietly closed to it. A smaller twin could land almost anywhere, slipping into airports large and modest alike. The giant, for all its splendor, was welcome in a far smaller number of places, and that limitation narrowed its usefulness even further. Gather these threads together now, softly, one by one, and you begin to feel the shape of the pressure that was building. There was the thirst of 4 hungry engines. There was the heavier burden of maintenance that came with more of everything. There was the relentless difficulty of filling every one of those hundreds of seats, flight after flight, and there was the expensive, specialized ground infrastructure that the aircraft required just to operate. Each of these on its own might have been manageable. Together, they created a steady, mounting weight on the economics of the airlines that flew the A380. You can imagine the conversations happening quietly in airline offices around the world. Executives looking at spreadsheets, comparing the cost of flying the giant against the cost of flying two smaller twins on the same route. And often the numbers told an uncomfortable story. The twins, being newer and lighter and more efficient, could carry passengers at a lower cost per seat. They could be scheduled more frequently, giving travelers more choice of departure times. They could serve smaller markets that the giant could never touch. Slowly, the financial logic that had once seemed to favor the largest aircraft began instead to favor the flexible fleet of medium-sized jets. None of this meant the A380 was a poor aircraft. Far from it. Passengers adored it, crews spoke fondly of it, and on the right route, flown full, it could earn its keep handsomely. But profitability in aviation is not built on the right route alone. It is built on hundreds of routes, on flexibility, on the ability to adapt to a world that never stops shifting. And in that broader picture, the very qualities that made the A380 extraordinary, its immense size and capacity, became the qualities that made it hard to fill, hard to place, and expensive to keep aloft. So the financial pressure grew, not suddenly but gradually, like a slow rising tide against a beautiful shore. Airlines that had once ordered the giant with excitement began to hesitate before ordering more. Some quietly considered how many years they would keep the ones they already had. The great plane still flew, still delighted everyone who stepped aboard. But behind the scenes, the arithmetic was tightening. And that tightening, gentle and impersonal as it was, would come to shape the fate of the largest passenger aircraft the world had ever known. For now, let that understanding settle softly and rest in the knowledge that the story still has further to travel through the quiet night ahead. Think for a moment about what an airline actually needs from an aircraft, and you begin to understand why the arithmetic mattered so much. An airline does not simply want a plane that fills up on the busiest days. It wants a plane it can move around, a plane it can send to a new city when demand shifts, a plane it can fill even in the quiet months when the crowds thin out. Smaller aircraft could do that with ease. They could hop between markets, chase the seasons, and slip into airports too modest for a giant. The A380, for all its grandeur, could not. It needed the crowds to come to it reliably, day after day, on the same well-worn corridors between the great cities of the world. And here is the gentle irony of it. The very thing that made the A380 so efficient when it was full was the thing that made it so unforgiving when it was not. A large aircraft flying half empty carries the weight of every unsold seat with it into the sky. It burns fuel to lift chairs that no one is sitting in. It pays the same landing fees, the same crew, the same maintenance whether the cabin is packed or sparse. So the plane that could be a triumph on a Friday evening out of a hub could quietly become a burden on a sleepy Tuesday afternoon, and airlines came to feel that difference in their accounts. There was also the matter of the airports themselves. Not every runway could welcome this aircraft. Not every terminal had gates wide enough or jet bridges tall enough to reach both of its decks. Airports that wanted the A380 had to invest, sometimes considerably, to prepare for its arrival. That meant the giant could only land where the ground had been made ready for it, and that narrowed its world still further. A smaller plane could go almost anywhere. The A380 could go only where it was expected, and expected in numbers. Meanwhile, the wider industry was quietly changing shape beneath everyone's feet. New engines were arriving, lighter and thirstier for efficiency rather than fuel. And they were being fitted not to giants but to slender twin-engine aircraft that could fly astonishingly long distances on their own. Suddenly, an airline no longer needed to gather thousands of passengers at a single mighty hub and pour them into one enormous plane. It could fly smaller groups directly, city to city, skipping the great connecting airports altogether. Passengers loved this. They could travel from one modest city to another far away without ever changing planes in a crowded terminal in between. This was the real shift, the deep current running under the surface. The A380 had been designed for a vision of the future in which air travel funneled through a handful of colossal hubs, with giant aircraft shuttling between them like ferries across a river. But the future that actually arrived was more scattered, more direct, more personal. It favored the nimble over the enormous, the flexible over the grand. And so the giant, built with such care for one particular tomorrow, found itself flying into a different one. You might expect, then, that the airline simply abandoned it. But the truth is softer and slower than that. The A380 kept flying, and on its best routes it kept thriving. Travelers still sought it out, still chose their tickets by the aircraft type, still marveled quietly as they walked its aisles. The plane had earned a devotion that pure economics could never quite explain. Yet devotion does not pay for fuel, and admiration does not fill empty seats, and so the tide kept rising, patient and steady, around the shores of this magnificent machine. What settles over the whole story in the end is a kind of tenderness. Here was an aircraft that did everything it was asked to do, and did it beautifully, only to find that the questions had changed. It was not a failure of engineering, it was not a failure of ambition. It was simply the meeting of a bold idea with a world that chose to move in another direction. And there is something quietly moving in that, something worth holding gently as the night carries on, and the story drifts onward through the dark. On the 14th of February in the year 2019, Airbus made an announcement that many had feared and few had wanted to say aloud. The company would stop building the A380. After all the years, all the ambition, all the marvel poured into this aircraft, the great assembly lines in Toulouse would eventually fall silent. The final deliveries were set for 2021, and once those last few planes left the factory, no more would ever be made. It was, in the plainest words, the end of the largest passenger aircraft the world had ever known. Now, you might imagine that such a decision would be dramatic, full of argument and last-minute rescue, but in truth it arrived quietly, almost gently, the way a long illness finally settles into its conclusion. Everyone in the industry had seen it coming. The signs had been gathering for years, in the sales figures that never quite matched the dreams, in the orders that trickled rather than flowed, in the airlines that admired the plane but hesitated to buy it. And so when the announcement finally came, it felt less like a shock and more like a truth that had been waiting patiently to be spoken. The reasons behind the decision were rooted in something both simple and unavoidable. An aircraft like the A380 could only continue to be built if enough airlines kept ordering it, and by 2019, the orders had all but stopped. The turning point came from Emirates, the airline that had believed in the giant more than any other, the one carrier that had built its whole identity around these enormous planes. Emirates had ordered more A380s than anyone else in the world, and for a long time it had been the beating heart that kept the production line alive. But even Emirates, the great champion of the giant, decided to reduce its remaining orders and turn instead towards smaller, more efficient aircraft. And once that decision was made, the math simply no longer worked. Here is the quiet truth of it. A factory that builds something so vast cannot run on a handful of orders. The tooling, the workforce, the suppliers, the whole intricate web of people and parts that came together to create each A380, all of it needed a steady stream of aircraft to justify its existence. When that stream slowed to a trickle, continuing to build became impossible. Airbus could not keep an entire production system alive for so few planes, and so, with what must have been genuine reluctance, the company chose to bring the program to a close. It was not a decision made in anger or disappointment. It was a decision made in the cold, clear light of arithmetic. For the people who loved this aircraft, and there were a great many of them, the announcement landed like a small grief. Aviation enthusiasts around the world had followed the A380 since its very first flight, had celebrated each new airline that welcomed it, had traveled out of their way simply to fly aboard it or to watch it lift into the sky. To them, the plane was never only a machine. It was a symbol of what human beings could achieve when they dared to build something impossibly large and impossibly graceful. And now they were being told that no more of these symbols would ever be made. You can perhaps understand the feeling. It is the same tender sadness you might feel watching the last of something disappear, knowing that what remains is finite, that each one flying is now part of a closed and countable family. The enthusiasts began to think of the existing A380s differently after that day. Each one became a little more precious, a little more worth seeking out, a little more worth photographing against the evening sky. The aircraft had not vanished, not yet, but its future had suddenly become a story with an ending already written. And so the final chapter of production began, slow and deliberate. The last few aircraft moved through the assembly line one by one, each of them destined for Emirates, the airline that had loved them longest. Workers who had spent much of their careers building these giants understood that they were assembling the final examples of something historic. There is a particular quiet that settles over a factory when everyone knows the work is coming to its close. The tasks remain the same. The rivets and the wiring and the vast wings still take shape, but every motion carries an extra weight, a sense of finality that hangs softly in the air. The very last A380 rolled off the line and was delivered in December of 2021. It went, fittingly, to Emirates, closing the circle that this airline had helped to open. And with that single delivery, the production of the largest passenger aircraft ever built came to its formal end. There was no grand catastrophe, no dramatic collapse, only the gentle turning of a page. The tooling was set aside. The specialized transport routes that had carried the enormous components across Europe would no longer be needed for new aircraft. An entire industrial effort, one of the most ambitious in the history of flight, simply came to rest. What makes this ending so quietly moving is the way it reveals the difference between grandeur and survival. The A380 was, without question, a magnificent achievement. It was beautiful to look at, wonderful to fly aboard, and a genuine triumph of engineering. In almost every way that could be measured by the heart, it succeeded completely. But airlines do not run on the heart. They run on numbers, on costs and revenues, on the patient accounting that decides whether a route earns its keep. And in that colder reckoning, the giant could not compete with the smaller, more flexible aircraft that had risen up around it. This is the gentle lesson that settles over the whole story. Being the biggest, being the boldest, being the most breathtaking, none of these guaranteed survival. The commercial realities that governed the airline world cared nothing for wonder. They cared only for efficiency, for filling seats, for burning less fuel across more routes. And when those realities finally spoke, they spoke clearly, and they outweighed all the grandeur that the A380 had come to represent. The plane that had been designed as a statement about the future found the future had chosen a different, quieter path. Yet there is something worth holding on to here, even as the production line goes still. The A380 did not fail because it was poorly made. It did not fail because the people who built it lacked vision or skill. If anything, it was almost too perfectly made for a world that was already slipping away from beneath it. It was a masterpiece born slightly out of its time, a magnificent answer to a question the industry gradually stopped asking. And there is a kind of dignity in that, a quiet nobility in having reached so high, even if the reaching could not last forever. So the factories fell silent, and the last giant took its place in the sky alongside its siblings, and the era of building the A380 came softly to its close. But an ending in production is not the same as an ending in the sky. The planes that had already been built would keep flying, keep carrying their passengers across oceans, keep drawing admiring eyes upward wherever they landed. The story was changing, gently shifting from one of creation to one of legacy, from the roar of the assembly line to the long, graceful cruise of the aircraft themselves. And as the night carries us onward, we can rest in the knowledge that even something that stops being made can go on being loved, can go on flying, can go on filling the sky with quiet wonder for years still to come. There is a strange and lovely thing that happens whenever an A380 is scheduled on a route. Passengers begin to seek it out. They study the aircraft type before they book, scrolling through flight options not just for the best time or the best price, but for the chance to step aboard the double-decker one more time. It is a devotion you almost never see attached to a machine. Most travelers, if we are honest, care very little about what kind of aircraft carries them from one city to another. A plane is a plane, a tube with wings, a way of getting from here to there. But the A380 broke that indifference. It made people care. It turned the choice of aircraft into part of the adventure. And that quiet loyalty tells us something important about what this giant meant to the people who flew inside it. Think about how unusual that really is, in a world where airlines competed on fares measured to the last coin, where travelers hunted for savings and shrugged at the details. Here was an aircraft that people would pay more to ride, wait longer to board, and rearrange their plans to experience. Frequent flyers traded stories about which airlines still flew it and on which routes. Aviation lovers planned entire trips around a single leg on the upper deck, and ordinary passengers, people who had never given a thought to engines or wingspans, found themselves smiling as they walked up the jet bridge, sensing that this flight would feel different from all the others. That feeling, that gentle anticipation, was something no spreadsheet could ever capture. What was it exactly that inspired such affection? Part of it was simply the sense of space. Step aboard almost any other aircraft, and you feel the walls close in a little, the ceiling press down, the seats crowd together in their narrow rows. But step into the A380 and the whole atmosphere changed. The cabin felt open, generous, unhurried. The ceilings arched higher. The aisles ran wider. Even in the standard seats, there was a subtle sense of room to breathe, a feeling that the aircraft had been built with generosity in mind rather than the relentless squeezing of every last inch. And that generosity registered in the body before the mind even understood it. Passengers relaxed, shoulders eased. The journey began to feel less like endurance and more like rest. Then there was the quiet. We have spoken already about the extraordinary engineering that made the A380 one of the softest sounding aircraft ever to cross the sky. The engines mounted far from the fuselage, the thick blankets of insulation, the windows layered against the roar of the outside world, and passengers felt every bit of that calm, even if they could not name its source. They would settle into their seats, and instead of the whirring drone that fills so many cabins, they would notice a hush, a smoothness, a stillness that let them sleep more deeply and wake more gently. People spoke of stepping off long flights feeling strangely refreshed, less battered than they expected. That was no accident. That was the giant working its quiet magic across 10 or 12 hours of darkness above the ocean. Testimonials gathered around the aircraft like affection around an old friend. Travelers described walking up to the onboard bar in the middle of a night crossing, glass in hand, watching the stars through the windows while the world slept below. Others remembered the showers on Emirates, that almost unbelievable luxury of stepping into warm water at 40,000 feet, emerging renewed as if the flight had barely happened. Some spoke simply of the smoothness of the ride, the way the enormous mass of the aircraft seemed to glide through turbulence that would have jostled a smaller plane, the heaviness that so worried the accountants translating for the passenger into a beautiful steadiness. The very size that made the A380 so costly to operate was the same size that made it so wonderful to inhabit. And so, on certain routes, the affection was matched by genuine demand. Between the great hub cities of the world, on the busiest corridors where travelers poured through in enormous numbers, the A380 found the conditions it had been designed for. Flights between Dubai and London, between Singapore and Sydney, between the major crossroads of global travel, filled those 500 seats again and again. On these routes, the giant made sense, not just in the heart, but in the ledger too, because the demand was there to fill the cabin, and the aircraft could do exactly what it was built to do, carrying vast crowds efficiently through the world's most crowded skies. Emirates in particular built much of its identity around the aircraft, weaving it so deeply into the fabric of its network that for millions of travelers, the A380 simply was the airline, the flying symbol of a certain kind of grand, generous travel. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the gentle irony of it all. The very same aircraft that struggled so badly in the cold arithmetic of the wider industry thrived beautifully in these particular places. Where the crowds were thick and the routes were popular, the A380 was not a burden at all. It was the perfect tool, moving more people through congested airspace than any other aircraft could manage, easing the pressure on runways and terminals that could only handle so many flights a day. The problem was never that the A380 could not succeed. The problem was that the number of routes where it could succeed was simply too small to sustain a whole fleet across the industry. But on those routes where it did belong, it was magnificent, and the passengers knew it. Ask people why they went out of their way to fly it, and you would hear the same themes again and again. They loved the smoothness, they loved the quiet, they loved the space, the feeling of not being packed in, the sense that the airline had chosen comfort over pure efficiency. They loved climbing the staircase between the two decks, that small theatrical moment that made an ordinary flight feel like an event. And more than any single feature, they loved the way the aircraft made them feel, cared for, unhurried, gently carried across the world rather than merely transported. It was an emotional response as much as a practical one, and emotions, as we know, are the things that turn a machine into a memory. There is a deeper truth hiding inside all of this affection, and it is a comforting one to rest on as the night carries us along. The A380 proved that passengers were never quite as coldly rational as the industry sometimes assumed. Yes, most of the time price won and convenience won, and the smaller, efficient aircraft carried the day. But given the choice, given the chance, people reached for beauty. They reached for comfort. They reached for the experience that felt kinder to the body and gentler to the spirit. The enduring love for the A380 was really a quiet vote for a certain idea of travel, the idea that a journey could be something to savor rather than merely survive, that the hours in the air could be a pleasure in themselves. And so even as the wider forces of the industry turned away from the giant, the affection of those who flew it never faded. It grew, if anything, sharpened by the knowledge that these aircraft would not last forever, that each flight aboard the double-decker was a chance that would one day disappear. Travelers began to treasure their A380 journeys as something precious and fleeting, a little piece of aviation grandeur they could hold on to. That love, warm and genuine and unhurried, was perhaps the truest measure of what the A380 had achieved, and it is a lovely thing to carry with us into the quiet as the great aircraft glides on through the darkness above. Every aircraft that flies today owes a small debt to the giant that once seemed impossible. And if you look closely at the modern cabins we now take for granted, you can trace a faint outline of the A380 running through nearly all of them. This is the quiet secret of the double-decker story. Even as the last examples rolled off the line and the great program came to its measured end, the ideas it carried into the sky did not vanish. They spread outward gently into the thinking of designers and engineers and airline planners who had watched the giant closely and learned from everything it did well and everything it did too boldly. The A380 was many things, but perhaps above all it was a teacher, and the lessons it left behind are woven into the aircraft you fly aboard today, even the ones that look nothing like it. Consider first the simple matter of size, and what the A380 proved was possible. Before it existed, there was a genuine question about how large a passenger aircraft could truly become before the numbers stopped making sense, before the weight became unmanageable, before the structure grew too heavy to lift itself into the air. The A380 answered that question with a resounding, graceful demonstration. It showed that an aircraft carrying more than 500 people across two full decks could climb smoothly, cruise quietly, and land gently, and that the engineering to make that happen already lay within human reach. Even if the world ultimately decided it did not need aircraft quite that large, the boundary had been pushed, and everyone who came after knew exactly where the edge of the possible now stood. There is something reassuring in that when you think about it. The A380 was not a failure of engineering. It was, in almost every technical sense, a triumph. The materials, the wings, the flight control systems, the sheer choreography of flying 1,000,000 pounds of aircraft with the calm precision of a much smaller machine, all of it worked beautifully. And those advances did not stay locked inside the A380. The composite structures, the refined aerodynamics, the quieter high bypass engines, the sophisticated systems that managed such an enormous flying object with grace, all of these fed forward into the next generation of aircraft, the sleek twin-engine long-haul jets that now carry so much of the world. The giant, in a very real way, helped raise its own successors. But the deepest legacy of the A380 was never really about metal or engines. It was about expectation. Before the giant arrived, the experience of long-haul travel was for most people something to be endured rather than enjoyed, a matter of hours to be counted down until they were finally over. The A380 quietly challenged that assumption. With its onboard bars and its private suites, its showers and its lounges, its staircase between the decks and its sense of open, unhurried space, it asked a simple question that the industry had rarely dared to ask. What if the journey itself could be a pleasure? What if the time in the air could be something you looked forward to, rather than something you merely survived? That question changed things, and it changed them permanently. Once passengers had tasted what a flight could feel like at its most generous, the old cramped standard began to feel a little poorer. By comparison, airlines noticed, even on aircraft far smaller than the A380, the ideas began to appear. The premium cabins grew more private and more thoughtful. The lie-flat seats became more common. The little touches of comfort and calm crept steadily into the way airlines imagined the passenger experience. The bar may not survive on every aircraft, and the shower may remain a rare and wonderful luxury, but the underlying idea that the cabin should be designed around human comfort rather than pure density, that idea took root, and it grew. And so the A380 left its mark not only on the machines that followed it, but on what we, the travelers, quietly came to expect. It raised the ceiling of what luxury in the air could mean. It gave the world a glimpse of a kinder kind of flying, and once seen, that glimpse could not be entirely forgotten. Every time a passenger settles into a spacious modern cabin and feels a little more at ease than they might have decades ago, there is a small echo of the giant in that comfort, a distant inheritance from the aircraft that dared to make the journey beautiful. There are lessons too, of course, and honest ones, tucked inside this story of ambition. The A380 taught the industry that being the biggest is not the same as being the wisest, that raw scale carries costs as well as glory, and that the future of travel would belong to flexibility as much as to grandeur. It reminded everyone that the world does not always move in the direction the planners predict, that assumptions about how people would choose to fly could shift beneath even the most carefully reasoned decisions. The hub and spoke vision that shaped the giant gave way to a world of direct, point-to-point journeys, and the A380, magnificent as it was, found itself built for a future that arrived a little differently than expected. Yet there is no shame in that, and this is perhaps the gentlest truth to rest on as the night deepens. To reach for something enormous, to gamble on a bold vision of what travel might become, is not a mistake even when the vision does not fully come to pass. The A380 was an act of aspiration, a collective decision by thousands of people across many nations to attempt something that had never been done, to build the largest passenger aircraft the world had ever seen, and to make it not merely functional, but graceful, quiet, and kind. That kind of ambition is rare and it is precious, and the fact that the world evolved around it does not diminish the courage it took to try. When you step back and take in the whole arc of it, the A380 stands as a testament to human ingenuity in its purest and most hopeful form. It represents that beautiful moment when engineers and dreamers look at what everyone believes to be the limit and decide quietly and confidently to press just a little further. It reminds us that progress is not always tidy, that some of the greatest achievements are the ones that reach beyond their time, and that the value of an endeavor is not measured only by its ledgers and its balance sheets, but by the vision it embodied and the possibilities it revealed. And so the giant leaves us not with a sense of loss, but with a sense of wonder. It flew, and flew beautifully, and carried millions of people across the oceans of the world in comfort and calm. It showed us what was possible, both in the metal that lifts us and in the experience we might hope to have while aloft. It pushed the boundaries of size, of luxury, of what a journey could feel like, and in doing so it enriched the entire craft of flight, whether or not another aircraft quite like it is ever built again. Some of those graceful giants still fly, gliding through the night on the routes where they truly belong, and each of them carries this legacy quietly within its enormous frame. So as we let this thought settle softly, let the A380 remain in the mind exactly as it deserves, not as a story of what did not last, but as a story of what humans can achieve when they dare to dream on the largest possible scale. It was a marvel, born of imagination and ambition and extraordinary skill, and its influence lingers gently in every comfortable flight that follows. Rest easy in that thought, and let the great double-decker carry you one last time softly into sleep. Somewhere over an ocean tonight, a great double-decker is still gliding through the dark, its wingtips catching the faintest silver of moonlight, its cabin hushed and warm while hundreds of people sleep inside it. And it began, as all great things do, as nothing more than a thought. A question really asked in quiet rooms across Europe more than 2 decades ago. What if we built the largest passenger aircraft the world had ever seen? What if we made it not just enormous, but graceful, not just capable, but kind? That question became a drawing, and the drawing became a shape, and the shape became a machine that could lift more than 1,000,000 pounds into the sky and carry it halfway around the planet without complaint. That is the arc we have traveled together through this long night, and now gently we arrive at its close. Think for a moment about how far the A380 came. It started as a bold vision, a gamble made by thousands of engineers and dreamers spread across many nations, each of them shaping a single piece of an idea that no one country could have built alone. Wings born in one place, fuselage sections in another, a tail assembled somewhere else entirely, all of it carried across the continent by ship and barge and road, converging at last in Toulouse where the pieces became a whole. It was one of the most complicated acts of coordination in the history of manufacturing, and it produced something that, when it finally rose from the runway, seemed almost to defy the very physics that made it possible. A plane that size should not have felt so smooth, it should not have been so quiet. And yet it was both, because that was the whole point of it. That is the memory worth holding on to as sleep draws near, not the balance sheets, not the difficult economics, not the day the world decided it would build no more of them. Those things are true, and we have spoken of them honestly, but they are not the heart of the story. The heart of the story is the feeling of stepping aboard and sensing almost immediately that this was a different kind of journey. The staircase curving between two full decks, the bar where strangers became companions somewhere over the Atlantic, the private suites with their doors that closed, the showers at 40,000 feet, the sheer unhurried spaciousness of a cabin that never seemed to press in on you the way other aircraft do. The A380 gave people room, and in that room it gave them something rarer still, which was calm. It earned a name over the years, this aircraft, one that suits it perfectly, the gentle giant. And every part of that name was true. Giant it certainly was, the tallest and widest and heaviest passenger jet ever to enter service, so large that airports had to reshape themselves to receive it, building wider gates and stronger runways and jet bridges that reached toward two decks at once. But gentle it was as well, in every way that mattered. Its four high bypass engines, whether the three-shaft Rolls-Royce design or the two-shaft engine Alliance version, were tuned as much for quiet as for power, their great fans moving vast rivers of air so smoothly that passengers often struggled to believe they were airborne at all. Its walls were thick with sound-absorbing insulation, its windows layered to hush the roar of the slipstream, and its sheer size held the engines far from the cabin where their noise could soften and fade before it ever reached your ear. Everything about it was engineered to make the biggest thing in the sky feel like the calmest place you had ever been. And here is the truth that lets the whole story rest easy. The A380 did not fail. It flew, and it flew beautifully, and it carried millions upon millions of people across the widest oceans on Earth in a comfort that no aircraft before it had ever offered. The world simply changed around it, drifting towards smaller, nimbler twin-engine jets that could fly directly between distant cities without ever needing the great hubs the A380 was built to serve. That shift was real, and it was decisive. But it was not a verdict on the aircraft itself. It was only a change in the shape of the sky, a turning of the tide that no one could have fully seen coming when those first drawings were made. The giant was answering a question the world stopped asking. That is not a defeat. That is simply the way that history moves. So consider what it leaves behind, this aircraft that dared to be enormous. It raised the expectations of everyone who ever stepped aboard it, teaching a whole generation of travelers that a flight could be more than endurance, that a journey could feel like a pleasure rather than a trial. It pushed the science of materials and aerodynamics and quiet cabin design further than it had ever gone, and those lessons did not vanish when production ended. They live on, quietly, inside the smaller aircraft flying tonight, in the composites and the insulation and the countless refinements that make modern flight more comfortable than it once was. The A380 poured its influence into the entire craft of aviation, and that influence will keep flowing long after the last of them is retired. In that sense, the gentle giant never truly leaves us at all. And some of them are still flying, remember. On the busiest routes in the world, where hundreds of travelers need to move at once between great cities, the A380 still finds its purpose, still rises into the evening air with that unmistakable grace. If you are lucky, you may yet ride upon one. You may climb that gentle staircase, settle into that spacious cabin, feel the softness of its takeoff and the near silence of its cruise, and understand in your own body why so many people came to love it. It asks for nothing but to carry you well, and to carry you well is the only thing it ever wanted to do. Let that be the thought that carries you now, as the night settles fully around you and the last of the day's weight begins to lift away. Picture the great aircraft high above the clouds, its lights glowing softly in the dark, its enormous frame holding steady and calm as it crosses the sleeping world below. Inside, everyone is at rest, held gently in that quiet cabin, unhurried and safe. There is nothing to do up there but breathe and drift and trust the giant to bring you home. That is the feeling the A380 gave to millions, and it is the feeling I hope stays with you now, wrapping around you like the hush of a cabin at cruising altitude. The A380 was an act of aspiration, a reaching towards something magnificent simply because it might be possible, and that kind of daring deserves to be remembered with warmth rather than regret. It was proof of what people can build when they set aside their doubts and dream on the largest possible scale, proof that ambition and grace can share the same wings, proof that even in a world of relentless efficiency there is still room to make something beautiful. It flew into a future that arrived a little differently than expected, and it flew there anyway, with dignity, with kindness, and with an elegance that no numbers could ever fully capture. So let your thoughts grow slow and soft, and let the great double-decker hold them for you. Its journey through history is complete, from a bold vision to a cherished memory, from a question asked in quiet rooms to a marvel that graced the skies of the entire world. It lifted us and lightened us and showed us how gentle even the biggest things can be. Now let it lift you too, one last time, carrying you softly upward through the calm and quiet dark until you drift gently and completely